The Eldari had seen countless civilizations rise and fall, each with its own unique potential. For eons, they had stood at the pinnacle of galactic power, their wisdom and technology far surpassing that of any other species. The galaxy had grown accustomed to their influence, and no one dared challenge their authority. They were the oldest and most advanced civilization in the universe, until humanity arrived. At first, the Eldari had viewed humanity's emergence into the stars with mild curiosity. They were primitive, after all, new to space travel, unrefined in their technology, and barely scratching the surface of the true potential of the galaxy. The other species around them saw humanity the same way, dismissing their efforts as naive ambition. But the Eldari were different. They saw the potential for something far more dangerous lurking beneath humanity's seemingly disorganized advances. Humanity's greatest strength, the Eldari recognized, was not in their technology, but in their unyielding spirit. While other species had often grown complacent, content with their civilization's achievements, humanity was driven by an insatiable desire to explore, learn, and above all, survive. And in their quest for survival, they had a terrifying habit of adapting, learning from every failure, and making rapid, unpredictable leaps forward. For the first time in millennia, the Eldari felt something they hadn't in a long time: fear. In the quiet, ancient halls of their council chambers, the Eldari gathered. The decision to address the galaxy was not made lightly. There had been debates, disagreements, and the reluctance to accept what they feared would come. Some Eldari felt it was too early to worry. Humanity was still in its infancy, they argued. Let them grow, let them expand, and they would eventually face the same fate as every other young species that had tried and failed to conquer the stars. But others, those who had witnessed the destruction of entire civilizations at the hands of rising powers, were not so sure. They had seen what happened when a species like humanity grew too powerful, when they were given too much room to evolve. The Eldari were deeply divided. But in the end, the decision was made. Humanity must be stopped before it was too late. The Eldari sent their emissaries to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, to the councils of the other major species. They called for an emergency assembly, a gathering of all those who might one day face the full weight of humanity's expansion. The message was clear, urgent, and impossible to ignore. "We have watched humanity for centuries," the Eldari warned in their transmission. "They are different from any species we have encountered. They are too dangerous to be allowed to grow unchecked. Their ambition, their adaptability, and their relentless drive for survival will bring chaos. We must act now to contain them before they become an unstoppable force." The galaxy's response was not what the Eldari had hoped for. Some of the younger species, intrigued by the idea of a new force in the galaxy, dismissed the Eldari's warning as alarmist. "We've seen this before," they said. "Another species gets too bold, and then they're brought back into line. Humanity will fall in line like all the others." Others laughed outright. Humanity, they believed, was too chaotic, too disorganized, and too divided to ever pose a serious threat. They were a blip in the vast expanse of the galaxy, nothing more. The Eldari, however, knew better. They had watched civilizations wither and die from within, torn apart by their own unchecked growth. The galaxy had never seen a species quite like humanity, one that could fall so far and rise so fast. And that, to the Eldari, was the most dangerous part. Humanity's potential was limitless, but so was its unpredictability. As the galaxy brushed aside the Eldari's warnings, the ancient civilization began to prepare in secret, not knowing whether they would ever need to act. But deep down they knew that humanity's rise could not be ignored for long. The galaxy had underestimated them once, and soon they would see what it meant to challenge a species that refused to be tamed. For now, the galaxy went on, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. But the Eldari were ready. They knew that the warning had been given, but they also knew that it was not enough. As the years passed, Humanity's presence in the galaxy grew steadily. What began as small tentative steps into the cosmos had turned into an ambitious expansion. At first, the other species dismissed humanity as just another fledgling civilization, no different from the countless others that had tried and failed to make a lasting mark on the stars. They were still in their infancy, still learning how to navigate the complexities of galactic politics, and yet their progress was undeniable. It wasn't long before humanity's starships could be seen across the galaxy, establishing colonies, engaging in trade, and forging relationships with other species. But humanity wasn't just content with existing in the shadows. They were driven by an insatiable thirst to dominate, to explore the uncharted corners of space, and to push the boundaries of what was possible. Unlike the more advanced races that had grown complacent, humanity saw the stars as a frontier to be conquered, not just admired from afar. Their curiosity, their adaptability, and their sheer will to survive and grow were forces that no one could ignore for long. The galaxy's established powers, once so confident in their superiority, began to take notice. Slowly but surely, the balance of power began to shift. Initially, some species tried to treat humanity like any other new rising power, making alliances, offering trade agreements, and sharing knowledge. But there was a fundamental difference in the way humanity approached these negotiations. Unlike most species, humanity didn't seek to blend in or simply coexist. They demanded respect, equality, and recognition as peers. They saw themselves as equals to any other civilization, regardless of how long that civilization had existed or how advanced it was. This didn't sit well with everyone. Many of the older, more established civilizations regarded humanity with suspicion. How could such a young species demand so much? The galaxy's political structure, built on centuries, or even millennia, of tradition, was suddenly being challenged by a species that had no history to fall back on, no ancient treaties to leverage, and no lasting cultural heritage. In the eyes of the galaxy's elite, humanity was a threat to the status quo. Human diplomats and leaders began to find themselves at the heart of tense negotiations. On one hand, humanity was praised for its boldness, its ingenuity, and its resilience. On the other hand, there were growing concerns about the potential consequences of humanity's rapid rise. Would they be content to coexist, or would they eventually seek to dominate the galaxy? In the corridors of power, whispers spread about humanity's uncanny ability to adapt and evolve at an unprecedented rate. Their technology, though initially crude in comparison to the more advanced races, was improving at a pace no one had predicted. Their starships, once simple and unreliable, now rivaled those of more seasoned spacefaring species. Their weapons, once nothing more than basic projectile systems, were rapidly becoming more advanced, capable of inflicting devastating damage on enemy fleets. As humanity's power grew, so too did the fears of the Eldari. Their warning, once dismissed as paranoia, now seemed far more prescient. The Eldari watched closely, their eyes narrowing as humanity continued to surprise the galaxy with its relentless innovation. Every new piece of technology they developed, every new victory they achieved, only confirmed what the Eldari had known all along. Humanity was different, and that difference was something no one, not even the oldest civilizations, could ignore. But the galaxy's reaction to humanity's rise was far from unified. Some species began to take note of the potential threat humanity posed, while others still insisted that they were nothing to fear. The debate raged on, but the fact remained that humanity was no longer just a curiosity. It was a force to be reckoned with. The more time passed, the more clear it became. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it all. For the Eldari, the warning they had given so long ago now seemed all the more urgent. The galaxy, once a place of relative peace, was on the verge of upheaval. And as humanity continued to push forward, determined to carve out its place in the stars, the other civilizations would soon have to decide. Would they accept humanity's rise, or would they attempt to stop it before it was too late? The stage was set for a galaxy-wide awakening, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The tension in the galaxy had been simmering for years, but it wasn't until the Zorathians made their fatal mistake that everything truly began to unravel. The Zorathians, a warlike and expansionist species known for their ruthless conquests, had long been the dominant force in their sector of the galaxy. Their empire stretched across dozens of star systems, and they saw themselves as untouchable. The Zorathians had never encountered a species that could challenge their might, and they believed that humanity, still a fledgling power, would be no different. Humanity had been expanding in the outer rim of the galaxy, establishing new colonies and securing resources that would fuel their growth. It wasn't long before they came into contact with the Zorathians, who saw the human colonies as a potential target for expansion. After all, the humans were weak, unprepared for a war with an empire as formidable as theirs. The Zorathians saw an opportunity to extend their influence and secure valuable territories, and they decided to strike. They launched a surprise attack on one of humanity's outer colonies, expecting a swift and easy victory. What the Zorathians didn't anticipate, however, was humanity's capacity for resilience and adaptability. The humans fought back with an intensity that no one had expected. The colony, though outnumbered and outgunned, refused to surrender. Rather than retreating or giving in to the overwhelming force of the Zorathian fleet, humanity fought back with every resource at their disposal. They used guerrilla tactics, exploiting the terrain of their home planet, and relied on makeshift defenses that had never been seen before. The Zorathians were caught off guard. They had expected to crush the humans without breaking a sweat, but instead, they found themselves bogged down in a prolonged conflict. The humans, despite their technological inferiority, were relentless. They adapted quickly, learning from their mistakes, and using every advantage they had to stay alive. For the first time in centuries, the Zorathians were forced to fight a war they hadn't planned for, and they were losing. The Zorathian Empire underestimated humanity's ability to turn the tables. The humans, with their small but resourceful fleets, launched a series of daring strikes against Zorathian supply lines, crippling their logistical operations. The Zorathians, so accustomed to domination, now found themselves on the defensive, retreating across the sector. The news of humanity's resistance spread quickly through the galaxy. Many were shocked by how the humans had turned the tide of the war. They had faced an empire that had conquered countless worlds, and yet had managed to hold their ground. The Zorathian fleet, once a symbol of invincibility, was now in retreat, and the humans had forced them to negotiate terms. For all their technological superiority, the Zorathians had been forced to accept a humiliating ceasefire. The victory was a turning point. Humanity had not only survived the Zorathian onslaught, but they had also proven that they could fight back, adapt, and win. The galaxy's other civilizations began to take notice, but not in the way humanity had hoped. Rather than admiration or respect, the victory sparked fear. The Eldest, who had been watching from the sidelines, were particularly alarmed. This was exactly what they had feared: the unexpected nature of humanity's capabilities, their ability to fight back against overwhelming odds, and the sheer determination to win. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and now it was clear. Humanity was not just a curiosity or a rising power. It was a force that could not be ignored. The question was no longer whether humanity would rise to prominence, but what the rest of the galaxy would do about it. For the first time, the Eldest began to consider that the only way to prevent humanity from becoming an unstoppable force was to act swiftly, before the galaxy's balance of power shifted irreparably. But they knew that stopping humanity would not be easy. The humans, it seemed, had only just begun to reveal the full extent of their potential. And now, every civilization in the galaxy would have to decide. Would they work with humanity, or would they be swept aside in the wake of its unstoppable rise? The first spark had been lit, and the galaxy would never be the same again. With the Zorathian conflict now in the past, humanity began to make rapid strides in both technological and political arenas. Their victory had not only secured their position as a formidable military power, but it also ignited a wave of confidence that surged through their ranks. Once seen as nothing more than a curiosity, humanity now commanded the attention of the galaxy. They had shown that they were capable of not only surviving in a hostile universe, but thriving within it. In the wake of their triumph, humanity pushed forward, expanding their reach into new sectors of the galaxy. No longer content to stay in the outer rim, they began to make their presence felt on the galactic stage. Colonies were established, research stations were set up on distant planets, and trade routes were carved through space. The human economy boomed as they mined resources from previously inaccessible systems, and their technology, once crude and limited, rapidly improved. They were no longer the unrefined upstarts of the galaxy. They were becoming a force in their own right. The galaxy's established civilizations, however, were deeply divided in their response. While some species, those that had always maintained a cautious distance from the more aggressive powers, saw humanity as an opportunity for trade, alliance, and cooperation, others grew increasingly wary. The Eldest, watching from the shadows, continued to voice their warnings, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. In the halls of galactic councils, humanity's representatives were met with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They were no longer the new kids on the block, but their rapid rise was still unsettling. The once proud Zorathian Empire, crushed by humanity's unexpected resistance, had retreated into the farthest reaches of their territory. The Zorathian leadership was in disarray, and their empire, once seen as an unshakable pillar of strength, was now fractured and vulnerable. Some of their colonies, recognizing the shifting balance of power, began to open diplomatic channels with humanity. They saw the writing on the wall and decided to align themselves with the growing human power rather than risk being left behind. Meanwhile, other civilizations began to question their own place in the galaxy. Humanity's rise wasn't just a matter of military conquest, it was ideological. Their insistence on self-determination, their rejection of galactic hierarchies, and their tendency to push the boundaries of what was possible made them seem like a wild card in the complex political landscape. Species that had once been content to maintain their positions of influence now found themselves forced to reconsider their strategies. Humanity, driven by a fierce desire to build, innovate, and evolve, represented something entirely new. The galaxy, once a mosaic of established powers and ancient treaties, now seemed on the brink of a major shift. The old order, built on alliances and rivalries that had endured for centuries, was starting to crack. Humanity's rise posed a threat not just to individual species, but to the very fabric of galactic politics. The question no longer was whether humanity would dominate, but how they would do it. Some factions began to consider alliances with humanity, seeing their potential as valuable partners in the coming years. The humans, after all, had proven themselves in the crucible of war, and their unyielding spirit made them trustworthy in a way that many older civilizations could not claim. However, there was a darker side to humanity's rise, one that many were reluctant to admit even to themselves. The humans' war with the Zorathians had been a victory, but it was also a warning. Humanity's ability to turn the tide of battle with sheer determination and innovation could not be ignored. Their willingness to sacrifice, to push through seemingly insurmountable odds, made them both a promising ally and a terrifying adversary. The Eldest, watching as the galaxy's political landscape shifted, grew increasingly concerned. They had known all along that humanity's rise could not be contained by diplomacy or treaties. The sheer unpredictability of humanity, their relentless drive, and their growing strength posed a threat to the carefully constructed balance of power the Eldest had maintained for millennia. The galaxy, it seemed, was on the cusp of an unprecedented transformation. As humanity continued to push forward, expanding and securing its place in the galaxy, the old civilizations of the universe found themselves at a crossroads. Some would bend the knee, hoping to align with the new power rising in the galaxy. Others, still unconvinced, would take a harder stance, believing that humanity's unchecked rise could only end in disaster. The rising tide of humanity's influence could not be stopped, but how it would reshape the galaxy was still uncertain. One thing was clear, though: the status quo was no longer viable. The galaxy's old powers had been shaken, and the future belonged to those who could adapt to the rapid changes humanity was bringing. As humanity's influence expanded across the galaxy, tensions began to rise in the sectors where their presence was most felt. The once stable borders of established empires were now being tested, and species who had enjoyed centuries, or even millennia, of autonomy began to feel the pressure of humanity's unyielding advance. While some civilizations sought alliances, others grew resentful of humanity's fast-paced, disruptive rise. To them, the human drive for dominance, no matter how justified, was an existential threat to their way of life. It wasn't long before the first cracks appeared in humanity's peaceful exterior, the spark that had ignited their rise. The fierce determination to survive and adapt was now leading to friction. Humanity, in its expansion, had encountered countless species who saw them as invaders rather than collaborators. The old power structures weren't ready to make room for humanity, and this led to unrest on several fronts. In one particular sector of the galaxy, a coalition of smaller species, once protected by the strength of the more powerful empires, formed a rebellion. These species, united by fear and desperation, sought to resist humanity's growing influence. They viewed humanity's success not as a beacon of hope, but as the beginning of their own decline. The rebellion was an amalgamation of species with varying motivations. Some feared losing their autonomy, while others were driven by old prejudices, and a few simply wanted to test humanity's strength in battle. Regardless of their individual reasons, they had one common goal: to challenge humanity's rise before it was too late. The rebellion struck with unexpected precision, coordinating attacks on key human outposts and trade routes. Humanity, still in the process of consolidating their territories, found themselves caught off guard. The rebels knew how to exploit the cracks in humanity's fledgling defenses. They hit civilian targets, striking fear into the hearts of human settlers who had long been isolated from the political chaos of the core worlds. The violence was swift, brutal, and unexpected, and it sent a shockwave through humanity's leadership. In response, humanity's military leaders, who had already proven their resourcefulness during the Zorathian conflict, mobilized quickly. The humans were no strangers to rebellion, and their ability to adapt under pressure made them formidable opponents. They fought back fiercely, not just with their fleets, but also using their network of colonies, civilians, and military assets to launch counterattacks. This was a war unlike any the galaxy had seen before, one where humanity's sheer determination and unconventional tactics made them a true wild card. Despite the rebellion's early successes, it quickly became clear that the resistance was no match for humanity's willpower. Humanity, after all, was built on overcoming obstacles. Their entire history had been defined by adversity. From wars to environmental catastrophes, humanity had always found a way to persevere. Now that same drive was being channeled into an all-out war for survival. The rebellion, which had seemed like a legitimate threat at first, was slowly being worn down by humanity's unrelenting pushback. Yet even as humanity made progress, the rebellion had forced them to reconsider their approach. This wasn't just a military struggle, it was a matter of ideology. Humanity had long prided itself on its belief in self-determination, and now, the galaxy's refusal to accept that ideology was forcing them into a corner. The question was no longer about whether humanity could conquer the stars. It was about what kind of galaxy they would create once they did. For the first time, cracks began to appear in humanity's own unity. While many saw the rebellion as a threat that needed to be eradicated, others, those who had come from colonies with histories of conflict, began to question if the cost of victory was worth it. The loss of civilian lives, the destruction of peaceful worlds, and the erosion of the ideals that had propelled humanity's rise started to weigh on their consciences. The galaxy was no longer just a place of exploration and trade. It was becoming a battlefield of ideologies. The Eldari watched this conflict with a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. They had warned the galaxy about humanity's potential, but even they hadn't predicted that the spark of rebellion would lead to such an intense conflict. Humanity's rise wasn't just about their ability to conquer. It was about their capacity to inspire both admiration and fear, unity and division, peace and war. And in the midst of it all, the galaxy would never be the same again. The shadow of rebellion had fallen over humanity's expansion, but it was clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger struggle, one that would shape the future of the entire galaxy. As the rebellion against humanity's rise continued to intensify, the conflict began to take on a darker, more desperate tone. The initial skirmishes had been one thing, but now full-scale battles erupted in multiple sectors. The galaxy had never seen a war like this, one that spanned vast distances and involved species who, up until now, had been largely separate from the human sphere. What had once been a localized series of uprisings against human expansion was now turning into a galaxy-wide struggle. The coalition of rebellious species, though diverse in their motivations and capabilities, grew bolder as they realized they had one shared strength: humanity's own vulnerability. Despite their rapid advancements, humanity's logistical networks, though improving, were still young, fragile, and stretched thin. The rebels exploited this weakness, launching surprise attacks on critical human infrastructure. They crippled supply chains, sabotaged communications, and struck at the very heart of human settlements. Entire colonies fell, and with each loss, the human resolve hardened. But the scale of the rebellion's success began to outpace what anyone had anticipated. Humanity's military had never faced such coordinated resistance from so many fronts. The rebels were skilled at hit-and-run tactics, overwhelming human forces with sheer numbers, and then disappearing into the vast expanse of the galaxy. The once invincible human fleets, with their ingenuity and unmatched resourcefulness, were now being forced into a defensive posture. The war was beginning to look like a war of attrition. With each passing day, human losses mounted, and the morale of the colonies began to falter. Civilians who had once embraced their newfound freedom in the stars now faced the stark reality of war. Fear gripped the hearts of settlers, who questioned whether humanity's rise had been worth the sacrifices they were now making. Was this the future humanity had fought for, or had they become just another empire bent on conquest at any cost? As tensions grew, so did the pressure on humanity's leadership. The higher ranks of the military, once unified in their resolve, now found themselves divided over the next course of action. Some advocated for total war, to crush the rebellion without mercy and prove that humanity's rise could not be stopped. Others, particularly those with ties to the colonies, argued for peace, at least a temporary ceasefire, so that the cost of the war would not be greater than the gain. Amid this internal conflict, the galaxy's other powers watched from the sidelines, unsure whether to intervene. The Eldari, having long predicted humanity's potential for violence, were now torn between their desire to contain the human threat and their reluctance to get directly involved. They had seen what humanity could do when pushed too far, but they also understood that humans could be reasoned with if given the right incentives. In the depths of the rebellion, however, there was a growing sense of something darker and more dangerous. Some factions within the resistance had begun to adopt more extreme measures, even going so far as to advocate for the complete eradication of humanity. These rogue elements didn't just want to slow humanity's rise. They sought to extinguish it entirely. For them, humanity's very existence had become a blight upon the galaxy, a challenge to the established order that could not be allowed to survive. As these extremist factions gained power within the rebellion, their tactics grew more brutal. Entire human colonies were wiped out in scorched earth campaigns designed not just to weaken humanity, but to break their spirit completely. The violence was shocking, far beyond what any of the more peaceful resistance factions had ever advocated for. Whole worlds, once thriving with human life, were reduced to ashes. The sense of horror and outrage spread through human ranks like wildfire. It was in this moment of crisis that the leadership of humanity realized they stood at a crossroads. Would they continue to expand, pushing forward with their relentless drive to dominate the stars? Or would they reconsider their path, recognizing that their very survival was now at risk? The galaxy's judgment would soon come, and the humans knew that no matter the outcome, the scars of this conflict would shape their future forever. Humanity was at the edge, not just of victory or defeat, but of extinction itself. The next decision would determine whether they would rise from the ashes of their own mistakes, or whether the rebellion would be the final chapter in their story. But one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same. The weight of humanity's plight was felt throughout every corner of the galaxy. The conflict had escalated beyond anything anyone had expected, and it was now clear that humanity was at a crossroads. The rebellion, fueled by a multitude of species and factions, had brought humanity to the brink of collapse. Whole colonies lay in ruin, and the once unstoppable military machine was now fighting a desperate defensive war. Every victory seemed temporary, and every loss seemed to drag humanity closer to the edge of extinction. But even in the darkest hours, humanity's resolve did not falter. The spirit that had carried them through centuries of conflict, survival, and exploration resurfaced once more. This was not the end. It was a call for unity, for a return to the very principles that had made humanity great. No longer could they afford to remain divided, torn between those who sought vengeance and those who sought peace. They needed something more than just military power. They needed a unified front, an ideological rebirth. In the heart of the human capital, the leaders of the United Earth Confederation convened. Desperation hung thick in the air as they debated their next move. The war had drained them, both mentally and physically, and the weight of the decisions ahead was immense. Some advocated for continuing the fight at all costs, to stamp out the rebellion once and for all. Others, more pragmatic voices, warned that the longer the war lasted, the closer humanity came to losing everything. What they needed now was not just force, but diplomacy. And then a voice rose above the others. It was Admiral Claire Forsyth, a decorated officer and a veteran of humanity's earliest battles in the stars. Forsyth had witnessed firsthand the horrors of war and the cost of victory. But she had also seen humanity's strength, its adaptability, its capacity for growth, and its deep-rooted desire for something greater than mere survival. She stood before the council, her voice steady but firm. "We can't keep fighting like this," she said, her words resonating through the room. "We are losing more than colonies. We are losing what makes us human. This war isn't about victory anymore. It's about our survival, our future. If we continue on this path, we'll burn everything to the ground. But if we unite, if we reach out, if we offer a hand to those who oppose us, we can end this. We can show the galaxy who we really are." Her words struck a chord. There were many who were tired of the fighting, tired of the losses, tired of seeing their people suffer. For the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps the solution didn't lie in war alone. The council knew that humanity had been founded on ideals of freedom, justice, and unity. Now, they had to live up to those ideals. A new plan began to take shape. It would not be easy, and it would require cooperation between the military and the diplomatic corps, two forces that had rarely been able to work together in harmony. But the goal was clear: to end the rebellion, not by annihilation, but by forging a new path forward. Humanity would not only fight for its survival, but offer a lasting peace. The plan was bold. It called for a galaxy-wide summit to bring together representatives from both the rebellious factions and those who remained loyal to humanity. It was a gamble, one that could either end the war or see it escalate even further. The military would continue to defend human-held worlds, but they would also work to open communication channels with rebel leaders, offering ceasefires, negotiations, and the possibility of reconciliation. The call for peace, for unity, was sent out across the galaxy. The response was mixed. Some factions rejected the overtures outright, too consumed by their hatred of humanity to consider peace. Others, however, saw the offer as a ray of hope, a sign that humanity might be willing to listen. Slowly but surely, small agreements began to be made. Ceasefires were established on certain worlds, and human emissaries began to meet with rebel leaders. It wasn't easy. There were old grudges to overcome, deeply held fears to dispel, but the groundwork for peace was being laid. However, even as the talks began, the shadow of distrust remained. Many within the human ranks wondered if they could ever truly trust the rebels, and many of the rebels still feared humanity's expansionist tendencies. But the offer had been made, and humanity was willing to prove its commitment to a peaceful future. In the end, the summit became more than just a diplomatic meeting. It became a symbol of what humanity could be when they came together, not just as conquerors, but as individuals who believed in the possibility of something greater. The galaxy watched as humanity extended an olive branch, showing the very qualities that had made them the most unexpected power in the universe: hope, resilience, and the courage to fight for a better future. The call for unity had been answered. Now, humanity's future was in their hands. The galaxy would not be the same, but whether it would be shaped by endless war or lasting peace was still to be determined. The summit had begun with uncertainty, tension hanging over it like a storm cloud, but as the days passed, something remarkable began to unfold. The galaxy, which had once been on the brink of total destruction, found itself watching humanity in a way it had never done before, not as a conqueror, but as a species willing to evolve, to reconcile, and to build a new future. For the first time in history, representatives from the human colonies and rebel factions sat at the same table, facing each other not with weapons drawn, but with words. It was an uneasy alliance, a fragile peace being forged between species who had seen only war for so long. Still, it was a start. Admiral Claire Forsyth, who had helped push for the summit, stood alongside diplomats from the United Earth Confederation, guiding the conversations toward compromise. She had witnessed humanity's strength and resilience during the war, but now she was witnessing something even more powerful: the willingness to reach out, to listen, and to offer a future beyond war. It was a bold experiment, but Forsyth had no illusions. This was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of something new. The first few rounds of negotiations were rocky. Old prejudices and fears ran deep. Some factions refused to even acknowledge humanity's right to exist as a galactic power, while others were still consumed by the desire for vengeance. But humanity, in its way, had proven that it was not bound by the same rules. Instead of fighting back with force, they listened. They acknowledged the pain of the galaxy's other species, recognized their fears, and admitted their own mistakes. Perhaps most importantly, humanity shared their vision for the future. Not a future built on conquest, but one built on cooperation, exploration, and mutual growth. They made it clear that their purpose was not to dominate, but to ensure that the galaxy had a place for everyone. They proposed the creation of a galactic council, an interspecies organization where every species, no matter how powerful or weak, could have a say in how the galaxy's future was shaped. This would be a place where conflicts could be resolved without war, where diplomacy would be the primary tool of governance. The path to this new future wasn't easy. Not all factions accepted the olive branch immediately, and there were still forces, both within humanity and beyond, that viewed the idea of peace as naive. However, the idea began to take root. Slowly, the first tentative steps toward real peace were taken. A ceasefire was declared across several contested systems, and humanitarian aid was sent to the devastated colonies and war-torn worlds. Humanity's resources, once solely focused on military conquest, were redirected to rebuilding and supporting those most affected by the war. The galaxy watched as humanity began to show that it could walk the delicate line between strength and compassion. The old powers, once consumed by their desire for dominance, were forced to reckon with this new reality. Some species hesitated, unwilling to trust so easily. Others, however, were willing to give humanity the chance to prove that their rise was not the beginning of another empire, but the dawn of a new age, a more cooperative, interconnected galaxy. Within humanity itself, the atmosphere had changed. What had once been a unified, militarized species bent on expansion now began to see the benefits of diplomacy, of creating something lasting. The colonies, which had initially been in the crossfire of the war, began to come together, not just as human settlements, but as beacons of cooperation. There was a new hope in the air, a belief that, even after the horrors of war, the galaxy could still be rebuilt. As the summit concluded, and the representatives signed the first tentative accords, it was clear that humanity's place in the galaxy had irrevocably changed. They were no longer just a rising power. They were a force for peace. The old ways, the cycles of war and conquest, had been broken. The rebellion that had once seemed poised to destroy humanity had instead been the catalyst for something greater. The galaxy was not a place of endless conflict anymore. It was now a stage for cooperation, for rebuilding, and for the forging of alliances that transcended the past. Humanity, in all its flawed brilliance, had found a way to change the future. And as the new Galactic Council took its first steps toward establishing lasting peace, one truth became clear. The universe's eldest civilizations had been right to warn about humanity, but not in the way they thought. Humanity, with its unyielding will, had not only survived the darkness, it had emerged from it, ready to guide the galaxy into a new dawn.